The patrons have spoken, and they've given us Pangoro, the fighting dark giant panda whose design is actually quite fascinating. It has one of the most unique evolution methods. As its pre-evo, the mono-fighting Pancham needs to be around dark types to evolve and gain the type for itself as sort of a bad influence. It's at this point that Pangoro's cape and chewing stick make sense, as it's inspired by Bansho, Japanese juvenile delinquents. That aside, being young and tough doesn't necessarily hack it in the competitive world. So we're jumping right in to see how Pangoro fared there. And so we asked, how good was Pangoro actually? Pangoro's relentless offensive brutality just becomes more insane the more you look at it. The beautifully synergistic, super effective, and neutral coverage, as well as high base power off of the fighting dark stab combination, check. A stunner of a base attack stat, check. No scrafty issues of low power here. Speaking of strength, Pangoro may lack Dragon Dance, but instead it gets Swords Dance. Good grief. Speaking of grief, Pangoro has an even easier time sending opponents into a state of mourning because one of its abilities is Iron Fist, turning this panda version of Danny Rand into one of the hardest hitting beasts in a game that, at least by this point, was no stranger to that concept. Unwallable wall breakers seemed a dime a dozen. You couldn't even slow it down with Unaware because it could opt for its second ability, Mold Breaker. When even the mighty Quagsire can't save you, you know you're in trouble. Though Mold Breaker wasn't even necessary if Pangoro wanted to skip the Swords Dance and go right into the immediacy of Choice Band, which was actually the preferred choice. With Pokemon like these, you often don't want to be too reliant on requiring a free turn for setup that actually gives your opponent a chance to play around you and risks you having a wasted move slot. And therein lies the beauty of Choice Band Iron Fist Pangoro. It dishes out some of the most frightening first turn damage you'll see in just about any tier. There's just about nothing that can switch into it without risk of getting demolished one way or another. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, Pangoro's final ability was Scrappy, which meant even ghost types couldn't switch into its hammer arm. Though with its stab crunch lying in wait, there weren't many ghosts that would dare try such a trick to begin with. So how was it that Pangoro landed all the way down in RU? Its boosted hammer arm brought the hammer down just as it did its speed stat. Oh right, the speed stat. As is the case for many of these big gun wall breakers, Pangoro's power may have been absolute cinema, but it was also slow cinema. The fact that Turin Panda's hammer arm dropped its speed didn't actually tend to make too much of a difference against offensive Pokemon. We're talking a Pokemon with base 58 speed, putting it behind famed slow Pokemon like Clefable and Swampert. Of course, Pangoro could invest in speed, so it would actually outrun many such Pokemon, at least at first, but Pangoro's concern wasn't the defensive Pokemon it destroyed, or would potentially lose the chance to destroy after a speed drop, since it was generally dealing such shattering damage that this downside was well worth the cost of doing business. No, Pangoro's concern was the fact that it was a very, very easy Pokemon to outspeed for anything that wasn't an all-out wall. Now, it wasn't all bad, as Pangoro was fortunate enough to not be both slow and fragile. Such a combination is as much of a death sentence as a fighting weak Pokemon eating its hammer arm. Pangoro may be slow, but it's not exactly a tank, but one would be hard-pressed to call it frail, considering its excellent base 95 HP alongside a perfectly serviceable base 78 defense and even 71 special defense. It's not going to take repeated hits, but it doesn't fear a light breeze, and this crucially allows it to tangle with the defensive Pokemon it's tasked with targeting. However, its flaws don't end there. While it may not be frail, it also has some notable weaknesses, especially the quad-effective fairy that resists both its stabs. Being so threatened offensively and defensively meant that Pangoro, for all of its power, failed to live up to its potential, at least at first. It was a decent Pokemon in Gen 6, but certainly on the rarer side. Still, if you wanted wall-breaking power, Pangoro would do the job nicely. Funnily enough, its Choice Band set revealed something more than just resist-crushing strength. It also provided incredible utility and momentum with one of the most unique switch moves in the game, Parting Shot. Apologies to Wolf Glick for the Proto-Incineroar jump scare. Anyway, Pangoro wielded Parting Shot like Gen 3 Zapdos. For instance, Zapdos uses Baton Pass even without a boost. It's simply excellent as a non-damaging U-turn. Of course, Parting Shot takes things a step further with how it drops the opponent's attack and special attack, meaning the teammate coming in with Pangoro's help does so even more freely thanks to the opponent's lowered capability to damage it on either side, or both sides of the attacking spectrum. When it didn't feel like predicting which resist the opponent would try to ward it off, Parting Shot let Pangoro skip the potential loss of momentum in favor of guaranteeing it'd keep it going. Still, Pangoro was limited in disguise. While its power was nice, it was a pain to get it on the field, and then have to rely on the meager 80 base power of Poison Jab to maneuver around fairy types. Additionally, Crunch as Dark Stab was good, but it could leave it wanting for something more. It wasn't quite Tyranitar level strong to where the 80 base power was just fine for it. Basically, though Pangoro could dish out some immense damage, its move pool held it back from doing so consistently. It often wasn't the effort to use such a power that had to work so hard to actually do the damage it was capable of. Not always, but often, it just matched up rather poorly against the metagame at large thanks to its deceptively underwhelming set of tools. They seemed fine, and certainly were, but in practice, the non-Hammer Arm Hammer didn't come down as hard as it needed to. Pangoro was thus a niche Pokemon throughout Gen 6 RU, and actually made its home in NU. There, the much lower stat totals running around meant in spite of Pangoro's flaws, it was able to generate switch-in opportunities more easily. Not easily, but more easily, and it was able to translate those switch-ins into heavy damage. It wasn't the easiest Pokemon to slap on a team, but it was the good kind of specific. Not the kind where its usage in practice is nil, and its viability is really more lip service than anything. No, Gen 6 NU Pangoro required some effort to compensate for its drawbacks, but if done well, it wasn't an effort that would go to waste, which couldn't be said for its RU counterpart. And then everything changed when the Hoenn region attacked. The invasion of those pesky Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire move tutors blessed Pangoro's move pool as if by Arceus' thousand hands itself. Sure, it still had its other flaws, namely its low speed, but you know how it struggled to actually do damage you'd think it capable of before? Yeah, that was gone. Nothing could take Pangoro on safely anymore. Fairy types no longer had to fear the poison jab that would often struggle to get the job done. Now they had to run in terror from Gunk Shot, whose massive 120 base power not only deleted them in a hurry, but also meant that the move didn't clunk into everything else as Poison Jab did. As Gunk Shot was effectively as strong as a stab Shadow Ball, and even had a nasty 30% poison rate to go with it. So pivoting around it was really tough. Even if you managed to get a ground type in against it, you could still have it ruined. Gunk Shot alone was huge, but the intensity was ramped up even further with Pangoro no longer needing to rely on the decent but only just decent Crunch for Dark Stab. Now it packed Knockoff. Hello, ultra spammable attack into everything. Now, Pangoro was just about equivalent to Bisharp in terms of strength, and not only was it unleashing ferocious damage, it also got rid of your leftovers, meaning it was even more impossible to take on. And that's still not all. Remember Pangoro's solid natural bulk? Well, it was now enhanced with the second form of Fighting Stab, Drain Punch. And what made this especially effective as both a method of dealing damage and healing was the fact that it was boosted by Iron Fist. This made it even more difficult to stop for defensive teams, not just because of its damage offsetting qualities, but because unlike Hammer Arm, it didn't drop speed, meaning you could no longer outspeed Pangoro with a fighting resistant wall that you pivoted in. Oh, and it gets better. For choice band sets, Pangoro had yet another amazing non-speed dropping option for Fighting Stab, having gained superpower. Pangoro was banned from NU almost instantly, downright comical in how outrun its destruction of the tier was, and simultaneously exploded on the scene as one of the most unstoppable attackers in RU. It was suddenly such a perfect Pokemon, it's as if a designer had been tasked with fixing all its problems. Pangoro's weaknesses and low speed could easily be bypassed by the classic tactic of teammates using switch moves for safe entry. Indeed, much like Pangoro's own Parting Shot, and once Pangoro was in against some hapless defensive Pokemon, the destruction was immediate. Nothing even came close to switching into Choice Band safely. A 4-attack Life Orb set excelled on Trick Room teams, where Hammer Arm speed drop was made an advantage, and the Swords Dance set, while often superfluous into offense, was the single biggest killer of the balance and stall teams that became ORAS RU's most defining. After a Swords Dance, Knockoff was a KO machine. Even with Mold Breaker as the ability over Iron Fist, +2 Drain Punches were still incredibly strong. This helped Pangoro heal off Life Orb damage and generally leverage its solid bulk out of KO range from the weak attacks that such teams threw at it. Even if something like Flygon Earthquake did a respectable chunk to it, it would then be wiped out by a +2 Drain Punch that brought Pangoro back to full. Even fairy types that threatened to actually one-hit KO Pangoro were only as safe as Gunk Shot's accuracy allowed them to be. And once again, even that stopper of Extreme Killer Arceus, unaware Quagsire, stood no chance in the face of the Gunslinger Pangoro breaking the mold. What stopped Pangoro? Pick an Arceus form and pray. It was a Pokemon that could be revenge killed, but was outrageously difficult to actually switch into and check. So much so that it was put up for a suspect test alongside the similarly controversial Moltres. Both of them were banned, and RU breathed a sigh of relief that the carnage Pangoro had wrought was now in the rearview mirror. Pangoro didn't wind up impacting UU, as it was a minor pseudo-Conkeldurr replacement after Conkeldurr's ban way down the line, but ultimately niche. So it remained in RUBL. No matter, that tiering status was a badge of honor, demonstrating how Pangoro had leapt from niche Pokemon to one of the single most destructive Pokemon in the metagame's history. Pangoro returned to RU in Generation 7, no longer broken in this faster, stronger metagame where even defensive teams could have huge bursts of power thanks to Z moves, but still be very dangerous. Its enormous bulk in conjunction with its solid natural bulk meant it was innately going to scare the daylights out of any team leaning at all defensively. It was one of the tier's premier wall breakers once again. It threatened the mighty Registeel like little else, as well as other staples like Snorlax and Mega Steelix, and delighting and laughing at the tier's sturdiest fighting resists like Doublade and Cresselia. Once Ultra Sun and Moon came around and ramped up the pace again though, Pangoro took a hit. It was still a viable choice, once again able to threaten common walls like Registeel and Slowbro, but had a more difficult time keeping up with the new meta, especially since another fighter, Virizion, was one of the tier's most elite Pokemon of any type. There was also Toxicroak to contend with. Obviously, neither of these Pokemon could approximate even a fraction of Pangoro's power, but their overall utility was far superior. So Pangoro took its talents to NU, and though it was also completely busted this time around, it still excelled. Gen 7 NU is a metagame dominated by Incineroar, apologies to Wolf for the second jump scare, as well as Slowking and Steelix. When these are your core defensive pieces, Pangoro's stab combination is in for a feast, and its Swords Dance set threatened to dissect popular balance teams. There were plenty of other great bulky Pokemon weak to stabs like Rhydon and Xatu, and even those just neutral to them like Druddigon, Blastoise, and Vaporeon got ripped apart anyway. But what of the ever-present revenge killer Choice Scarf Passimian? Not a problem. Pangoro's go-to item was the close combat weakening Chopo Berry. It also loved running priority in the form of the Iron Fist boosted Bullet Punch, which meant it wasn't just enough to outspeed it anymore. You could have something as fast as Aerodactyl or Whimsicott and you'd still get decked. Now, there were plenty of Pokemon that could potentially interfere with Pangoro, namely the Poisons, Weezing, and Garbodor, as well as the Fairy-type priority of Comfy's Triage Draining Kiss, but nothing was truly safe. All it meant was that the Pangoro user had to plan ahead a little in the team builder and battle, or could just load up the Choice Band set and spam knockoff into everything, which would leave both huge damage and lost items in its wake. Things that resisted not being answers, quote unquote, so much as that thing which lets you not get immediately destroyed by it. You might think to use Z Crystals to weaken knockoff and not have your item removed, but no Z Crystal user comfortably switched into Pangoro because nothing really did. So it was an admirable idea that wouldn't actually work much in practice as much as you'd like. You'd be better off saving your Z move user for maximum impact to make up lost ground, rather than risking it in a well-reasoned but ultimately full-heartedly attempt to minimize Pangoro's power. Pangoro shared the tier with its fellow fighting dark type Scrafty, which was also a great choice against the metagame, but Pangoro was undoubtedly superior. It may as well have been Urshifu for how thoroughly it bludgeoned everything around it. Its natural bulk was much lower than Scrafty's, but for how strong it was actually quite adept at taking hits, making it difficult to safely handle even for offensive teams. For instance, Specs Heliolisk, another one of the tier's best Pokemon, would never KO Pangoro with Thunderbolt or Hyper Voice, even after Stealth Rock. The Pangoro Express left the station of Generation 7 with another series of successes under its belt. Gen 8's Dex Set and removal of Megas and Z Crystals meant Pangoro's knockoff was scarier than ever. It began in RU once again, as is tradition, one which continued insofar as Pangoro didn't last in RU, but the tradition was updated, as Pangoro no longer being RU wasn't because it fell out of the tier and landed in NU, rather the opposite, as Pangoro moved up to UU, and not in that it technically exists as a mini conch. No, this time UU Pangoro was the real McCoy, with the tiering status to match. You know what's really great? It had nuance to its place in UU. It wasn't just smashing everything in sight. Yes, it was also doing that, obviously, as the games had never been more poorly prepared for Pangoro's pulverizations and was punished accordingly. But what was wonderful beyond this is that its usual expected role was that Pangoro had actual defensive value, and man was it important. It was now more than just a meathead muscle move masher. Its defensive presence was key in checking two of the scariest setup sweepers around, Shell Smash Poltegeist and Dragon Dance Necrozma. These Pokemon were so strong, they could often run away with entire games with just a boost, and bulky offense teams tended to lack the tools needed to deal with them, but Pangoro answered them wonderfully, giving such teams much needed leeway against two of their most dangerous threats. Pangoro's offensive capabilities weren't just business as usual either. Receiving two major buffs first, it was finally able to wield close combat as its fighting stab, meaning it was even more deliriously capable of spamming its incredibly powerful moves. And just as importantly, if not more so, it began using Scrafty as its ability. This was helpful to make sure Ghost couldn't absorb the close combat it wanted to spam, yes, but the real value was that Scrafty now blocked Intimidate. Forget slowing Pangoro down with the likes of Arcanine, it'd get blasted just like everything else did. Pangoro was downright elite in early Gen 8 UU for this peerless offense blended with such crucial defense, but sadly, the Dexit effect was partially undone by the DLCs to come, which led to Pangoro tumbling all the way down back to NU, which sounds sad until you realize Pangoro was not set to simply settle for where it had ended in the previous generation. It was no surprise that it was excellent in NU. It's not even really that much of a shock that it was so excellent in NU, that it was a source of controversy, but that's not how it felt to face Pangoro. That was more akin to having your teeth rattle in your jaw upon the bone-crushing hit it leveled with you, no matter how braced and prepared you were for the impact. And you actually went through the bans of several fighters in Gen 8, with Surfetch'd, Machamp, and Beware, and Pangoro were put on that same chopping block. In fact, at the same time as Beware. Ordinarily, suspect testing two Pokemon simultaneously is forbidden, but an exception was made as Pangoro and Beware were basically doing the same thing, clicking Choice Band in close combat. That's all they had to do. Yeah, but their coverage, nope, close combat. Yeah, but fighting resist, nope, close combat. Yeah, but they have checks. You already know what I'm going to say. Yes, they could obviously click other moves. Pangoro's knockoff was also one of the game's most ferociously spammable moves, as the fighting resists were utterly terrified of them, but that's exactly why they didn't have to do it in so many cases. They could simply play it safe with Choice Band close combat and overwhelm just about everything. Funnily enough, in most instances, close combat was not close, because the duel so decidedly destroyed all in sight. That is, unless both teams had one, as became quite often, in which case the closeness of the combat intensified, with each sacrifice both players had to make to the opposing fighter as they raced to try and win first. You certainly weren't going to win games playing a longevity-focused game in the Pangoro Beware world. In the end, Beware actually received the higher ban percentage by some margin, but both Pokemon were seen as equally broken in the eyes of the player base, as they both wound up banned for the lack of reliable answers to their unstoppable close combat. Pangoro remained NUBL by usage, but this was no indication of its RU viability, as it was actually quite good there. It dissected the tier's slow, bulky staples, like Registeel, Reuniclus, Rhyperior, and Pokemon that didn't begin with R, such as Metagross. Nothing switches into knockoff comfortably if for the item removing effect alone. Togekiss may resist both stabs handsomely, but it loses its heavy-duty boots, and suddenly it's not comfortable at all. And this is before considering how it gets decked by Ironhead, which is preferred over Gunk Shot because of how it lets Pangoro obliterate even the seemingly perfect answer that is Galarian Weezing. The closest you get to a safe answer is a Vileplume that already lost its item, and even then it's just barely hanging on. Plus, if Pangoro goes with its newly gained Darkness Lariat, Vileplume is toast. Generation 8 has been another major success for Pangoro, wrapped up in a stellar lower tier career. Ever since gaining knockoff and other weapons in ORAS, it's repeatedly crushed RU and NU, quite possibly to the tune of a ban, having been axed from NU twice and RU once. We hope to see Pangoro back in the competitive scene come Gen 10, and hopefully with something a little extra to let it keep up with the times so it can unleash its wickedly powerful stabs once again. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.